I would not like to get either Pieter Vive or myself in trouble because of copyright questions. That's the first. The second is, I would like you to enjoy the session, and if at any point I'm not clear, either because the internet connection is poor or because my own voice is trailing off, just let me know. And also, if you have any questions or comments as I'm speaking, please just signal, and I will be happy to pause and listen to what you have to say. Have you any questions before we begin? All right, no questions so far. So let us begin, as they say, at the beginning. And I'm going to share the screen. Can you see the screen? Okay, good. Very good. When Julia first invited me to join this formation camp and told me that the theme was violence, I wondered what aspects of violence we could look at. And I thought, at the moment, I'm carrying out some research into political violence, especially political violence which is lethal, which causes death. So I decided I would talk about that, but to look beyond the actual violence itself and to see whether the memorialization, the collective memory of lethal political violence can teach us anything about the civic virtues which build a well-functioning political community that is also protective or that nurtures the common good. We are living in rather dark times. Some scholars in my field, in public policy, speak about the beginning of a new dark age. There is a drift towards authoritarianism. Climate change is going to bring a great deal of disruption. We know about the vast movements of migrants fleeing war, fleeing persecution, fleeing drought and hunger and lack of economic opportunities. In some respects, the times recall the century leading up to the downfall of the Western Roman Empire. That particular process brought about what was called the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages were in some respects very dark, not least because we know very little about what happened there. But in other respects, they were also times of grace, times of light, times when, particularly in the West, through the Catholic Church, some of the most important legacies of Rome were preserved, were cultivated, were married to the faith, and then laid the foundations for a new beginning, a new civilization, the Renaissance. So in the spirit of this session, I would like to begin with a short poem, which is also a prayer. If you like, a prayer, a little bit of desolation from the great Indian poet, Rabindranath Tagore, from Gitanjali. This is a prayer for light. Light, where is the light? Kindle it with the burning fire of desire. There is the lamp, but never a flicker of a flame. Is such thy fate, my heart? Death were better by far for thee. Misery knocks at thy door, and her message is that thy Lord is wakeful. And he can, sorry. He can, I cannot read properly. He came thee to the love tryst through the darkness of light. The sky is overcast with clouds, and the rain is ceaseless. I know not what this is that stirs in me. I know not its meaning. A moment's flash of lightning drags down a deeper gloom on my sight, and my heart gropes for the path to where the music of the night calls me. Light, oh, where is the light? Kindle it with the burning fire of desire. It thunders and the wind rushes screaming through the void. The night is black as a black stone. Let not the hours pass by in the dark. Kindle the lamp of love with thy life. Kindle the lamp of love with thy life. The central question that I propose to try to answer with you is this. Is it possible for the memorialization of lethal political violence to also promote civic virtue within a polity, within a political community? And in order to find answers to this question, I'm going to look in the story of two Maltese memorials. The photograph on the left is very similar, records a memorial that is very similar to the Maltese memorial to Daphne Caruana Galizia. In this case, this is a memorial to Boris Nemtsov, who was killed in 2016, just outside the walls of the Kremlin in Moscow. Boris Nemtsov was one of the leading, if not the leading, opposition figures in Putin's Russia. Immediately after he died, an informal memorial sprang up on the bridge where he was killed. And to this day, every day, activists gather there at night to restore, to renew the memorial. They are frequently assaulted, sometimes arrested, and very, very frequently the memorial, the flowers, the photographs, the slogans that they put there are cleared. This is very much the story of the Maltese, one of the two Maltese memorials that I will talk about. You already know something about me, and I won't repeat what Valentina has said. I will just draw your attention to my perspective. What I'm trying to do in this session is to read the signs of the times in the light of the gospel. In other words, looking for signs of hope, and hope is different from optimism. Optimism means simply smiling at grief and wishing that things will be better. Hope is something else. Hope is much more certain. Hope comes from our experience of the resurrected Christ. So I'm looking for signs of hope in the darkness that seems to be enveloping the world. And as well, among the forces which crush the human spirit, lethal violence is intended to crush the human spirit, to crush opposition, to crush critical thinking. But in itself, it also, not infrequently, carries signs of hope or of new life. So I'm going to proceed as follows. I'm going to talk first a little bit about the phenomenon of lethal political violence, deadly political violence. Then, also briefly, I will talk about the memorialization of violence and about the two principal traditions through which lethal political violence is embedded in the collective memory. And then I will proceed to look at the two Maltese memorials. I'll give a little bit of background about Maltese history, political history chiefly, for those of you who are not familiar with the islands. And then I'll talk about the events leading up to these two memorials and the consequences of both memorials. I plan to talk for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then I'll be happy to engage in discussion with you. But as I said earlier, if anybody would like to ask a question or to clarify something as I talk, I'll be very happy to pause. So let's look at the association between deadly violence and politics. This is a photograph taken during the Second Chechen War. A Chechen fighter looking upon a mass grave of civilians. This is a poster recording 22 Pakistani journalists killed in just 1 year for reporting on events in Pakistan. And here is a photograph from a pictorial record by Tony Gentile on the mafia in Sicily and the war waged by the mafia against the Sicilian state in the 70s and the 80s. These are three aspects of political violence: the killing of journalists, organized crime taking on the forces of law and order, or vice versa, the forces of law and order taking on people who are allegedly criminals, but in many countries also people who are simply vulnerable and poor, and exterminating them without due process. And then there is the classic exposition of deadly violence and politics, which is war. In fact, we can quote Clausewitz, the great German theoretician of war. I'm paraphrasing somewhat and modifying. Clausewitz said, "War is a true political instrument. It's a continuation of political intercourse carried out with other means, with violent means." And I'm altering that and saying lethal violence, all kinds of lethal violence in public life, is indeed a political instrument. In contemporary society, lethal political violence, which especially occurs in the killing of journalists, in protests, in ethnic cleansing, is intended, or rather arises, when the ordinary mechanisms for resolving disputes, especially in fragile democracies or imperfect democracies, are no longer able to handle the conflict. And the result is that either the forces of the state or the opposition forces take violent measures to resolve the conflict their way. So lethal violence is a true political instrument. It is a continuation of political intercourse, political engagement, but carried out through violent means. How is lethal political violence memorialized? Well, the memorialization of deadly political violence began in earnest about 100 years ago, more or less with the end of the First World War, which was a cataclysmic and traumatic experience of violence on an industrial scale. Millions of people, chiefly in that war, it was chiefly soldiers, were slaughtered using the machinery produced by the Industrial Revolution. Tanks, machine guns, even more than tanks, barbed wire, and so on. And this trauma led in many countries, beginning with the United Kingdom and France, to the creation of official memorials to the dead, to the victims. So it was the state, really, which began to memorialize deadly violence. Of course, not simply as a tribute to the dead, but for very specific political purposes. Let's look a little bit more at this tradition and the exposition of this tradition, the visible expression of this tradition. This is Ottawa and the war memorial to the Canadian dead of the First and then later on the Second World War. You can see some similarities between this war memorial and the cenotaph in London. So on the one hand, you have the austerity, the monumental austerity and strength of the granite, which forms the base of the memorial, and the arch. The arch is also a triumphal arch. And then you have the dynamism of the lower collection of figures, who are figures of soldiers from various corps of the Canadian Armed Forces. And then at the summit of the memorial, you can see the triumph of these victims and the triumph of victory as well. In fact, although it is not clearly visible, there is a laurel wreath. The memorial is guarded by a member of the elite of the Canadian Armed Forces. You can see he's wearing a uniform with a bearskin, very similar to the Guards division of the British Army. We'll say a little bit more about this genre in a short while. Now let's look at something else. The memorialization of victims of other kinds of political violence, the kinds we've just talked about, people killed by organized gangs, by criminal gangs, people killed because they are journalists uncovering uncomfortable truths, people killed by terrorism. This is the kind of memorial that appears. Here is the memorial which appeared within hours of the killing of the journalists from Charlie Hebdo in Paris. These memorials consist of flowers. They have no particular order. They are spontaneous. They are frequently accompanied by slogans, by tributes, by affirmations of resolution. This may have destroyed these lives, but it will not destroy us. So we have, in essence, two memorial traditions. One is state-sponsored. It's very deliberate. It's monumental, permanent, and there's a note of triumph about it. The other is private, although of course it is displayed publicly. It's spontaneous, it's ephemeral. In other words, it's made of materials that are not intended to last, but which have a great deal of significance to people. If you want to show affection to anybody, the first thing you do is send a bouquet of flowers. So these memorials tend to be temporary. They're here today, gone tomorrow. And the emphasis is on tragedy rather than triumph. Let's look a little bit more closely at the first tradition. The first tradition glorifies the state and the nation. The paradigm of this tradition is the war memorial and the great equestrian statues. You know, the statues of kings and generals and presidents and revolutionary heroes mounted on a great white charger. The initiative to create the memorial is taken right at the heart of the state. Generally, it is a decision by the head of state or the head of the government. These memorials are triumphal symbols of state power and success. They also remind people of civic duty, of their, especially young men, their duty to defend the state or the republic. The memorials are generally situated very far from the site of the violence. You do get great memorials, for example, on battlefields, but the memorials which people see every day are the memorials in the center of a capital city. These memorials are settings for official rituals, and in those rituals, the state and the nation are reproduced, redefined. Year after year, as an anniversary comes up, the ritual reaffirms the state and the nation and reenacts the existence of the state and the nation. The second tradition, let's call it the Charlie Hebdo tradition, mourns the human predicament. This is a tradition which grieves the human predicament of being subordinated, subjected to deadly political violence. The memorials, as we said, generally consist of floral bouquets. There are handwritten tributes. Very often there are photographs as well. The comparison is not with the great permanent memorials of war, but more with what you find at a grave site immediately after a burial. These initiatives are generally taken from the grassroots. There's spontaneous outpourings of sadness. They are informal and they tend to be unstructured. They express the shock that everybody experiences when there is a horrific act of political violence. They may express anger. They frequently express resolution. This will not be the end. And they tend to be located either at the scene of the crime, Boris Nemtsov's memorial, outside the walls of the Kremlin on the bridge where he was killed, or else they are adjacent to the place, to the symbol of state power. This is the case with the memorial from Malta. Let's go back to the first tradition and look a little more closely at the meaning. The official memorials are narratives of history and of memory that are crafted by the elites, by the state elites. And therefore, they are tools, devices, by which the elites legitimate the actions that are commemorated. They legitimate the war. This was a just war. This was the war to end all wars. This was a war against tyranny. This was a revolution against a corrupt regime. They are used both to build the state and often to build the nation as well. And this is especially the case in nations which have a weak or a fragile identity. I don't mean to offend anybody, and I stand to be corrected, but think of the memorial to Vittorio Emanuele II in Rome, the size, the scale of that memorial, to me is a kind of reaction to the fact that at unification in 1860, large parts of Italy rejected the dominance of Piemonte. So the greater the memorial, in a sense, subliminally, it may reflect a fragile or still forming national identity. Contrast that with the really modest cenotaph in London to the two world wars. It's just a column, a granite column on a plinth, and only one wreath is laid there. Now, this is not the whole story about this first tradition. These monuments become a focus of popular protest, even challenges to the regime. When things go wrong, this is where people congregate, and this is the kind of monument that they will attack and try to bring down. So every time there is a revolution, memorials start to tumble. And generally, it is the memorials that have glorified the previous regime and the state run by that regime. Going back now to the second tradition, these memorials affirm human solidarity in word, Je suis Charlie Hebdo, and in deed, by giving the floral tributes. They are testaments, not narratives. They don't recount a story. They bear witness to people's feelings, to their emotions, to their hopes, and to their resolution. And so, even though they tend to be very short-lived, these memorials become a way of reaffirming community, building community. They are also instruments of dissent, testaments of dissent. Because they do not have a sponsor, for the most part, they do not have a sponsor, an official, powerful sponsor, they tend to be temporary. As I said, they may last a week, maybe a fortnight. Very few of them continue for months or years. The memorial to Boris Nemtsov and the memorial to Daphne Caruana Galizia, which I will talk about later on, are unusual in this genre. Now, if you are living in a troubled regime, it could be democratic, not just an authoritarian regime. The site of these memorials becomes a space where contests between the authority of the state and the protesters are played out. And they are played out in rituals of repression by the state and resistance by the protesters, by the dissidents. Is it clear so far? Okay. Would anybody like to put a question or a remark? Okay, in that case, I'll proceed. These are the two memorials that I will talk about later, but we will see more photographs of them and of what goes on around them. One last word, the connection between memorials and civic virtue. We said that memorials are laden with symbolic meaning, but they are also tools for teaching and learning. They have pedagogical value. The elements of the memorial and the activities that are associated with the memorials affirm the virtues which create and nurture, encourage an effective political community. And I'm going to try to show this by looking at the history of these two Maltese memorials. The static memorial is the memorial to the Great Siege of Malta. I'll explain in a minute. The informal memorial at the foot of this is the memorial to Mrs. Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was a journalist who was killed in Malta in October of 2017. But again, more about that later on. Let me first tell you a little bit about Malta and the context for these two memorials. Malta is the smallest member state of the European Union. It's a tiny archipelago, but for the last 500 years, it has had enormous strategic importance. It is the southernmost point of the European Union, midway between east and west and north and south. And for the last 500 years, since 1530, as a matter of fact, when the crusading knights of St. John established their base here, this archipelago has been at the center of a zone of civilizational encounter. I use the word encounter, not clash, because it isn't only clashes that have taken place. Essentially, there are three great civilizations which come together in the southernmost part of Europe, in the center of the Mediterranean. The Islamic civilization, the Orthodox civilization rooted in Byzantium, and the Latin civilization of Western Europe rooted in Rome. And Malta has been the meeting point of these three civilizations for actually more than 500 years, but the Orthodox civilization withdrew from this zone round about 1090. One of the most important events in Maltese history was the Great Siege of 1565. 35 years previously, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, had given Malta to the crusading Knights of St. John, who had just lost Rhodes in the eastern Aegean. The Ottoman Empire, aided by tributary states in North Africa, laid siege to this in a last effort to destroy the Order of St. John. And between May, the 17th of May of 1565, and the 14th of September of the same year, the Knights of St. John and the islanders, the Maltese islanders, were besieged here. They emerged victorious. The Ottomans and the North African regencies withdrew and never really returned. There were occasional alarms, but never anything comparable to the Great Siege. The Great Siege was a turning point because immediately after, the Knights received a great deal of support to create a stronger base here, and they founded, the following year, they founded Valletta. And with the founding of Valletta, the beginnings of Maltese statehood appear. A city-state appears instead of just a naval base. This also marks the origin of our state tradition. Paradoxically, Malta has not been an independent state for very, very long. We became an independent state in 1964. Before that, from 1530 until 1798, there were the Knights of St. John. From 1800 until 1964, there were the British. There was a very brief period, 2 years, where the French were here. So the Maltese were always subordinated to an external power. However, there was, from 1566, there was a fully functioning state. And almost all the offices in that state were held by islanders. So at the top, you would have the Grand Master and the senior knights, or the French commissioner, or the British governor and the British lieutenant governor. But the rest of the apparatus, for the most part, was in the hands of islanders. I'm not going to call them Maltese because many of them were migrants, but in any case. So although we have been a sovereign state run by the Maltese only for 56 years, in practice, there is a very long state tradition, an older state tradition indeed, than many, many contemporary members of the European Union. Now, from around the early 1800s, a sense of Maltese identity began to grow. But right up until this century, this identity was contested and was linked with concerns about the political future and the economic future of the islands. The most enduring of these contests, in which the Great Siege Monument is implicated, lasted 80 years, the so-called language question. The language question argued simplistically, should the official language of Malta be Italian or English? The elites felt that they were Italian, or felt an affinity with Italy. A great many of the working class and some of the middle class felt an affinity with the British, who ruled the islands during that period. And this set up an extraordinary controversy which was not settled until the beginning of the Second World War. What emerged from this was that the Maltese language became one of two official languages, the other being English, and that is still the position today. As I said, Malta became an independent state in 1964. It's a parliamentary democracy on the British model. But if you think that there was a struggle to become independent, well, that's not altogether true. The Maltese, many Maltese, were very doubtful about whether we could survive without the British. There was a similar contest over accession to the European Union, a bitter political divide, which divided the country between 1998 and 2004. From 1958 to 1964, again in 1981 to 87, and for the last 7 years, we have had extended constitutional and political crises. And there is also a great deal, there has been a great deal of political tension, including political violence. If any of you have visited Malta, you probably came away with the idea that this is the party island. Well, for visitors, this is probably true. But if you are Maltese, one learns to live with endemic political tension. And the tension reaches a climax, especially at election time. On the 16th of October 2017, just a few months after a parliamentary election returned the Labour Party to government for the second time with a greatly increased majority, Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was an outspoken critic of the Labour Party and whose investigations had revealed evidence of money laundering and corruption reaching right to the summit of the government, was killed by a car bomb. Immediately, that evening, the day that she was killed, this memorial appeared in Valletta. Spontaneous memorials appeared in other places, in Spinola and other places, but those lasted just a couple of days. The one in Valletta continues to the present day. In November of last year, a senior member of a family business conglomerate that has close ties to the Prime Minister and the Chief of Staff at that time was arrested and charged with commissioning the murder. The Prime Minister's Chief of Staff himself was implicated, though so far no charges have been brought against him. From that point onwards until the end of January, almost daily, there were large-scale protests around the memorial to Mrs. Caruana Galizia in Valletta. On the 12th of January, the Prime Minister was in fact forced to resign, and a new Prime Minister from the same party was elected. And one of the first acts when he took office was to order the cleansing authorities to leave the memorial alone. So that's by way of background. Now, a few words about the two monuments, the two memorials, sorry. And I'll start with the Great Siege Monument. Let's first look at the physical location. Here is a map of Valletta, which, as you can see, is a walled city, one of the most heavily fortified cities in Europe. Here is a close-up of the area of the memorial. The memorials, both memorials, are located in the center of this circle, in a small square called Great Siege Square. This is the geographical center of Valletta. It is also the center of what I call a triangle of power. So just outside the circle, there is the largest building in Valletta, which is the President's Palace, the seat of government to the present day. Across the square are the law courts, and immediately behind the square is St. John's Co-Cathedral. So you have judicial power, the executive and legislative power of the state, and ecclesiastical power, the seat of ecclesiastical power. And the memorials are situated in the center of this triangle of power. So the symbolic significance is very great indeed. Let's have a look at the memorial. Here it is, as it would look before Mrs. Caruana Galizia was killed. The building behind it is the Co-Cathedral, which is a state church. Originally, this was a church of the conventual branch of the Order of St. John. The Knights were a religious order. So in the center of the city, they placed not the Grand Master's Palace, but their church, the great church of St. John. Now, you can see in the foreground the back of the memorial. Facing the memorial across the square is the neoclassical building housing the law courts. That is a building which went up in the late 1960s. The original building housing the law courts was very badly damaged during the Second World War, and it was no longer suitable for housing the courts. So just after Malta acquired independence, again, to celebrate independence, the government of the day commissioned a number of prestigious public works projects. This was one of them, and the other was a remodeling of the entrance to the city, to Valletta. On the 8th of September of every year, the memorial is the setting for one of these rituals of state. You see a guard of honor mounted by the soldiers of the Maltese army. We do have an army, by the way. To the left, you can see on the lower part of the photograph, a wreath from the President of Malta. In the distance, there is the memorial. Immediately after the President lays the wreath at the foot of the memorial, and the guard salutes both the President and the memorial, the state authorities assemble in front of the memorial and hear a speech, which is generally a speech about the state of the country. I wish we could go into these discourses, but unfortunately, we don't have the time. But they themselves are the subject of a very interesting study. And over the last 7 years, there has been a very interesting shift in the emphasis of the speeches, as well as in the people who are chosen to give the speeches. The 8th of September was for many years, from the 1920s, as a matter of fact, the National Day. Today, it is no longer the National Day. It is one of 5 days, national feasts, commemorating different episodes in Malta's history. The 8th of September has been celebrated since 1566 as Victory Day. It marks the lifting of the first great siege, the 8th of September, 1565, when the Ottomans began withdrawing from the country, although battles continued until the 14th of September. But the army, the bulk of the army and the navy began to withdraw. It also marks the 8th of September of 1943, when the second great siege, Malta was besieged by the Axis powers in June of 1940 and continued besieged until September of 1943. On the 8th of September 1943, Italy surrendered to the Allies, to the United States, Britain, and the Italian fleet surrendered in Malta's harbors. This is a close-up of the 3 figures on the summit, on the plinth of the memorial. I'll say a few words about each of them. So, as I said earlier, this is the center point of a triangle of power. The head of state, who is also the head of the legislature and the executive, ecclesiastical power and judicial power, the law courts. The Great Siege, which the memorial commemorates, was a founding moment for Maltese statehood. The memorial was commissioned by the first democratically elected Maltese government. So the first Maltese government to be elected was 1921, when we acquired a measure of self-government, though still under British sovereignty. In 1927, on the eve of parliamentary elections, this monument was unveiled. The party holding office at the time belonged to the pro-Italian movement in the language question, and they commissioned the monument from Antonio Shortino, who was Maltese, but who worked in Rome. He was probably the finest sculptor ever to emerge from Malta. The monument is artistically very similar to a monument in the Italian Chamber of Deputies, La Glorificazione della Dinastia Sabauda. You can see the memorial is establishing a symbolic bond with what the government of the time believed to be the mother country, Italy. In fact, the inaugural speeches were delivered in Italian and Maltese at the height of the language question. Interestingly, they were not delivered in English. No speech was delivered in English. And again, there is a symbolic significance there. The 3 figures represent faith from left to right. Faith, you can see the woman holding the papal tiara in her hand. Fortitude, the masculine figure, which is wearing armor and holding a sword. And the female figure on the right holds the head of Minerva, which is the goddess of wisdom. That figure represents civilization. So what were the Maltese political elites proclaiming through this memorial? First of all, they were recalling the founding event in the Maltese political tradition, in the Maltese state tradition. Both in choosing the figures of the memorial, as well as locating it where they placed it, they are memorializing the bond between the state, the church, and the nation. And they're also proclaiming the affinity between Malta and Catholic Latin Italy. The memorial, the figures in the memorial, also speak about the virtues of the political community which was then being formed. The virtues of faith, of fortitude, of civilization and wisdom. And so this memorial tells us that the legitimacy of the political community comes from the way it honors these virtues. And finally, because the political community honors these virtues, its constitutional aspirations for autonomy or, at the time, unification with Italy must be honored. So this was a message not just to ordinary people, it was a message to the British authorities as well, to the British colonial authorities. Are you with me? Any questions or remarks?
For who wants, I just posted the image of the glorificazione della dinastia to make the comparison at least.
Okay, very good, excellent. All right, shall we continue? I think somebody would like to join us. There's a point here.
Prof, you are muted.
Right. So something has gone seriously wrong. No? Okay, there we go again. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. So in 1927, when the monument was unveiled, the Maltese political community was governed or subjected to an alien state, the British state. This community was irreconcilably divided about the ethnic and the cultural identity of the nation. We were a nation that had a fractured, contested identity. Besides that, also, the political influence of the Catholic Church was beginning to cause resentment. At the time, the Archbishop held second place after the governor. The Archbishop, both in state ritual as well as in substance, was a more influential figure than the Prime Minister. When the British took any decision about Malta, it was with the Archbishop that they consulted or negotiated, not with Maltese politicians. And of course, there was a new class of secular politicians coming to hold political office, and they resented this ecclesiastical influence. In fact, in 1930, the first serious crisis between church and state broke out, and as a result, the constitution had to be suspended because for the first time, but not the last time, the Maltese bishops imposed ecclesiastical sanctions on anybody voting for the pro-British party. In the 1950s and 60s, they imposed the same ecclesiastical sanctions on people voting for the Labour Party. in the light of this uncertainty, turbulence, the Great Siege Monument could not craft a collective identity around the memory of the Great Siege. Instead, it attempted to state a collective identity around the virtues, and it also represented the functional bonds uniting the church, nation, and state. So memorials do serve a purpose. Their symbolism is not empty symbolism. Those, particularly the elites, who look at them can read their symbolism very well. So let's now look at the Daphne Memorial. Something has happened to, oops. I don't know why, but my mouse is misbehaving. Let's go back. Okay. So this is the memorial as it looks and has looked since the 17th of October, 2017. This is what takes place every month on the 16th of every month in front of the memorial in the evening. Two civil society associations, which sprang up immediately following the killing of Mrs. Caruana Galizia, hold a vigil there. Throughout November and December, and on several occasions in January of this year, the vigils attracted thousands of people, and they were followed by protests and demonstrations, with the crowd moving from that square to the Auberge de Castille, which houses the Prime Minister's office and which is the de facto seat of government. Almost every night, employees of the government, acting on the instructions of the Minister of Justice at the time, cleared the memorial and destroyed the flowers, destroyed the photographs, destroyed the candles, everything. The photograph on the right shows the scuffles which also broke out at the monument. Here, the man wearing the green t-shirt is intervening to prevent the woman on the left, who is Mrs. Caruana Galicia's sister, from restoring the candles and the photographs on the Great Siege Monument. On several occasions, people have been assaulted or pushed to the ground even. You can see that emotions around the monument run very, very high indeed. And even though now the memorial is not being cleared, the tension around it is still very considerable. Thankfully, at the moment, we are not in lockdown, but there are restrictions on assembly because of the pandemic, and so these incidents have not recurred. School children from independent schools, it has to be said, are sometimes brought to the memorial. So the pedagogical value of the memorial can be seen in this and other scenes. The government went to extraordinary lengths to distance people from the Great Siege Monument. At one point, the entire memorial was cordoned off, supposedly to have it restored. And in fact, this didn't serve its purpose, because at night, activists went and re-established the memorial just outside that cordon. But you can see even crash barriers were installed, forcing people to squeeze through a narrow corridor if they were going towards the lower parts of Valletta, or if they were entering the law courts. These cordons were erected at the time that the protests were taking place. So November of last year, December, and into early January. They have now been cleared. So the Daphne Memorial, as it is now called, has become a shrine to an icon of civic virtue. Well, can we say that Mrs. Caruana Galizia was an icon of civic virtue? She was a very controversial figure. Very brave, I give her that. She was also terribly divisive, very, very divisive. And so much of what she wrote was written in a way that was intended to stoke people's emotions, not their reason. There was a great deal of hatred and poison in what she wrote. In fact, this is what made her popular. People read her blog for the gossip that it contained, as well as for the real, very real revelations that it contained. This tells me something about activism and independent journalism, the risks associated with these very necessary activities. It is necessary to have activism. It is necessary to have journalism. But it's also important to remember that these are two-edged swords. They may disclose the truth, but the truth is often divisive rather than truth which brings about reconciliation. Remember the words of Jesus himself. I came to bring fire and a sword, not peace. The peace that Jesus gives is something altogether different. It is a peace that comes from the relationship with Christ, not necessarily from the discovery of truth. And again, Christ tells us that the truth is not a set of facts. That is only part of the truth. The truth is himself. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And this is, I think, very important for the Christian political activist to bear in mind. So it may seem odd that the Great Siege Monument and the Daphne Memorial hold the same ground. In fact, it isn't odd at all. There is a profound affinity between them. Because the Daphne Memorial also narrates a story of origins. It gave birth to a new politics and a new republic. And this came from the supreme sacrifice of Mrs. Caruana Galizia. As I said, although this is a shrine to an icon of civic virtue, the memory and the memorial are as divisive as the journalist herself. The memorial became the center of a contest between Occupy Justice and Republica, these new civil society associations, against the state and the Labour Party. In the contest, Occupy Justice and Republica speak about grief. They protest against the corruption of the Maltese state and Maltese politics. They seek to perpetuate the memory of a very brave woman. And the contest on the other side is about indifference, as the best thing for the state and the Labour Party would be to forget Mrs. Caruana Galizia. Triumphalism, the slogan of the Labour government was, we never had it so good, L'aħjar żmien ta' pajjiżna, and repression. The clearing of the monument night after night was an act of repression, of censorship, just as much as the scuffles which sometimes broke out there. Both the Great Siege Monument and the Daphne Memorial, to me, call for a new covenant, or a renewed covenant between the state and the nation. A covenant resting on the virtues of faith, fortitude, and wisdom, the virtues of the Great Siege Monument, and justice, integrity, and vigilance, the virtues represented by the Daphne Memorial. So Great Siege Square, this little square in the center of Valletta, is a political arena and a sacred space, just as much as the Colosseum in Rome was a political arena where the rituals renewing the Roman Empire and the bond between the people of Rome and the emperor were played out, and a sacred space. The Colosseum was made sacred by the blood of the people who were slaughtered there, especially the Christians who were slaughtered there. In the same way, Great Siege Square is a political arena and a sacred space. Since 1919, in what were called the 7 Giugno disturbances, that square has been the centerpiece of numerous confrontations. The buildings around it as well, St. John's Co-Cathedral, for decades was the object of a battle between church and state in the 50s, 70s, and 80s. The law courts are the place where the political parties and ordinary people take on each other and the state using the constitutional provisions governing fundamental rights and freedoms. And in the square, since 1919, hundreds of thousands of people have congregated over the past century to protest, to seek change, to confront abusive authority. The memorials make it a sacred space. The memories that they represent are holy memories, but they're also contested memories. This is the great paradox of collective memory. In a country which is, I call it an uneasy democracy, a democracy that is not yet fully at ease with itself. The rituals of remembrance, those organized by the state, reproduce the state. The rituals of remembrance carried out by Occupy Justice reproduce an imagined, a desired political community. The unresolved contradictions in Maltese politics and the conflicts there make it impossible for the memorials to inspire national unity. But the memorials affirm, remind us of the virtues which will consolidate the polis and help us to secure the common good. To conclude, because time is pressing, the Maltese memorials teach us quite a lot about the purposes served by the memorialization of lethal, deadly political violence. Memorials are unable, or able only to a limited extent, to inspire unity in communities which are traumatized by unresolved conflict, especially if there is deadly systemic violence. However, these memorials also have a pedagogical value, a formative value. The vigils that are held, whether they are organized by the state or organized by civil society, help to restate and to inspire civic virtue. And especially for new civic movements struggling to clean up or to renew politics in a troubled political system, merely maintaining the memorials is a training in political virtue, in courage, in political strategies and tactics. this is what I had to say. If there are any questions, any remarks, if anybody disagrees with some point that I have made, I will be very happy to engage. I've taken a little longer than I intended. I hope I did not drive you to distraction.
Thank you very much.
So you can unmute your audios and contribute. Valentina will moderate.
Okay. Yes, so if there is any question, we have like 20 minutes at least. Yeah, Giulia.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much. I had no doubt that, at least for me, it would be incredibly illuminating. Also, I would like to share two things, actually. One of them is a personal thing, and another one is just a reflection, but I wonder if you have any comments to make on it. So the first one is personal because for those of you who do not know, I am a guide as well. And one of the main places I guide is precisely in Valletta. And I always stop in front of this Great Siege Monument. And actually it is recommended that we do not speak about the photographs which are placed there or about the story of Daphne Caruana. It is better to simply speak about the monument and the story of the Great Siege, and it's something in the past, no? But I don't care about that. I want to talk about the story that is happening, you know, contemporary history also. And in any case, the people that are in front of you are immediately curious to who this person is. Why are there these flowers? Why are there these quotes? What are these faces? They don't care about the monument, you know. I care about it as an art historian, but the people want to know what, you know, these papers are, this, which has no artistic value, really. So they would rather know about this story. So that's the curiosity. And actually, I had two experiences which are extremes over there. One of them is once I was explaining this to a group of students, telling them the story behind the murder of this journalist. And at the end, when I finished, a man approached us and he literally started shouting at me. And at the people I had with me. He's like, do not listen, she has an agenda, she's speaking poison to you. You know, all I was doing is saying the facts, that is all. And in a way, it stopped there. I didn't even, you know, I didn't even reply to him, but he was very aggressive, you know. And the second extreme was someone coming up to me and shaking my hand, like telling me, please keep on saying the story. As if saying the story is as important to keep it alive, you know, because the flowers and the candles, they die, you know, the flowers die, the candle runs out of wax, and they have to be replaced. But the stories, we have to keep saying them in order to continue this memory. So that is my personal experience. But the thing I really wanted to comment on is when you spoke of these memorials, I couldn't stop making the connection to the function of the church as a building. We like to talk of we often mention that the church is a monument. And there are here experts in etymology, and breaking down the word monument is to make memory of something, no? And every kind of, in a way, how I was seeing it, no, the church is like a combination of the first and the second tradition of memorials, which is something triumphant, as something that you would see as a state memorial, no? Something which is meant to be permanent, not ephemeral. So it has this level to it. But at the same time, it's a place where we are meant to grieve, no? Where we are meant to have hope, where we are meant to have these slogans that it will get better, there is salvation, whatever. So in a way, it's like a combination of both. And even the placement of the church, in the middle of the community, everything is taught, about its placement. So I don't know what, and also, yes, even how the church actually began as a building, something which begins as something that does not last, which is meeting without a structure, be it underground and then meeting in the house, no superstructure that is permanent. But eventually with time, the church building developed into something very, very loud. Like the most triumphant moment of the church building is the Baroque age, when the church was at its weakest, actually, because of the Counter-Reformation and all this. So that made me think of the Vittorio Emanuele moment, that, okay, since the church is weak, then build big buildings, with a lot of gold and all this. So I don't know about this parallel, between the two. The church as a public memorial, at least of the Christian community. But my worry is about this passing of time. What happens to a memorial with the passing of time? Do we fall into indifference? Because it seems that the most effective memorials are the ones which do not last, like the Daphne Caruana Galizia Memorial, which I don't know what will happen in the future, but in a way you have to be active. So you have to physically place flowers for a memorial to remain very, very effective. With the passing of time, it seems to become very indifferent, our attitude. For example, when we approach a church, if there isn't someone to explain to you, this is our experience as living stones, if there isn't someone to explain to you what the portal means, or what the facade of the church means, or what the paintings inside means, complete indifference. It's as if the memory is no longer there. I don't know, these are just some reflections. I wonder if you would like to comment or elaborate on this.
Would anybody else like to comment before I come in?
I just want to say what you were saying, Julia, is making me think of a question we have in Paris now about Notre Dame. And it just made me think of this, but about who is going to decide what Notre Dame becomes, and also about do we want something more majestic or more simple? And the last thing you said about the memory being active, and I think also in the church the building is a memory, but also each one of us is a witness, and maybe the people don't always remember what the building means, but we as individuals, as communities too, we can always be a witness of our faith. So in certain points, the building, the memory is not always so efficient, or has to be recalled. But in another point, as long as I am alive, if I want to tell about it, if I want to talk about it, I can keep this memory alive too.
Shall I respond to these points? I really like the way you explained the function of a church, Julia, both its formal and its informal. I would simply add one point, which is, unlike every other memorial, the community actually assembles inside the church. So it becomes like a womb almost, like a maternal womb. Churches in any country have an ambivalent relationship, both with the community as well as with the state. And the relationship is fluid. Sometimes you'll have a state which closes churches. At other times, it will actually rebuild churches. Putin's Russia rebuilt the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, which had been dynamited by the Bolsheviks. Of course, there is a political purpose in all of this. So as with any public building, whether it be a royal palace or a barrack block or a hyper-modern building housing the central bank or a great cathedral or indeed a humble church, there is always some political significance. By that I mean, this is about the transactions of power in a community. The other point that I would like to make is that memories are never static. Memories are constantly changing, and their meaning is also reinterpreted time and time again. With every generation, for every poet who writes about a monument or about an event, the memory is not just restated, it's reworked. And perhaps the most wonderful testament of this is sacred scripture. Scholars now, biblical scholars now tell us about all the layers of writing and editing in virtually all of the books of the Bible. As the community of faith rethought the memory of great events like the Exodus or of ecstatic experiences like being in the desert and running out of food and water, and then having the manna and the water coming out of the rock. The same with the memories of Christ's life, passion, death, and resurrection. In a sense, the only memories which are static or fixed in a point in time are the letters in Scripture. But we ourselves interpret those with each generation in the church. So the way we receive my favorite piece of Scripture, Paul's letter to Philemon about the runaway slave. The way we receive it today is very different from the way Philemon himself received it. Any other thoughts, challenges, questions, suggestions?
So I have, it was very interesting for me and very inspiring for many reasons. So I have, several ideas of how to read those monuments that usually, from my point of view, when I see a monument that, for example, the Second World War, for me, it's basically nothing, doesn't mean anything now. I also find them ugly. So it's very interesting to read a bit of this. And I was thinking about something that say very clearly in this contrast between the Great Siege monument and this Galizia monument. Okay. They are, from my point of view, different in the sense that one is focusing on the virtues, and the other one is focusing on a person. And I was thinking many examples that now came to my mind. So I associate these monuments that focus on virtues more with the Second World War monuments, or for example, in Italy, we have the many places where you remember the, how it's called in English, the people who fought against the fascism. So
the partisans.
The partisans, yes. So I think, yeah, can be associated with that. And on the other side, I thought about those monuments that I saw of Stalin. This big statue that represents one person, and this one person is the message, basically, in that case. And have been like destroyed completely, or in many cases, I don't know if there is still some bone in some. And they were very ugly, like made of concrete and nothing else. It was just a symbol of power, representing a person, not virtues, but basically all inside a person. And this also made me think about the churches, how you can read church in both ways. If it is an encounter, and this is more like maybe a Christian should read the church, or like a collection of virtues. And if you enter a church, you can enter a church like a place where you are, I don't know, oppressed. Maybe there's a list of virtues, or a place where you can have an encounter. And so as Livingstones, I think we would like to stress more the encounter. So yes, it's a reflection, but I don't know how it, if it could be a good way to distinguish those memorial, like memorial that focus on the virtues and memorial that focus on somebody that somehow represents virtues. So,
yes. This is a very interesting point. I would argue that the Daphne Memorial, the Boris Nemtsov Memorial, the Charlie Hebdo memorials, those also were really about the virtues, but they commemorate a traumatic event and a person. So in that sense, while the initial impact is the person, you see a photograph of Mrs. Caruana Galizia, or you saw a cartoon from Charlie Hebdo. So that was the first point of reference. But then, if one stops before the memorial, in a vigil, for example, then you begin to see the slogans, justice. One of the things which often appears on the Daphne Memorial is the last thing that she ever wrote, a few minutes before she was killed. There are crooks everywhere you look. Now the situation is hopeless. So there is, even spending a little more than a few seconds in front of the memorial, one goes beyond the event and beyond the person to look at something else. The identification with the person means that the monument has a far greater impact. And that is why I think it is probably better able to teach and to inspire than, let us say, the Great Siege Monument. Not only because the Great Siege Monument commemorates something that happened almost 400 years ago, but because there is an immediacy in the memorial to Mrs. Caruana Galizia. That's one reason why autocrats, kings, dictators like Stalin and so on, put up so many statues of themselves. They will not put up something abstract. They will put up a statue of themselves, very often with a quotation from them. This was especially the case with Mao Zedong in China, for example, because the first impact is the connection with the person. So there is an encounter as well. encounters, like memories, are very subjective things. So today, if I could, I might go into a church. I'm coming burdened and weary. And the first thing that will strike me in the church, maybe, is the things that I shouldn't really be thinking about. The marble, the statuary, and so on. Or I might be relaxed and coming into a simple chapel of perpetual adoration, and it's completely bare of everything except for the Eucharist. And that is what I encounter. My mood and the setting will help me to make that encounter. We're talking about very subjective things. Perhaps the great challenge for people like yourselves who help others to make an encounter with the church, with art, with sacred art especially, will be to convey the many moods and the many layers of meaning that are embodied in the buildings, in the art, so that at some point, the people listening to you, the people with whom you are, will be able to make the connection.
Thank you. Any other question, comment?
I would like just to react to the words of Julia as question for you, Professor Warrington, about the role of the interpretation, or the role of the person who is in front of the monument as witness in harmony or disharmony with the monument. I found very, very interesting the thing Julia narrated. So as far as she was somehow a testimony or a witness in harmony with this monument, or with what happened in this monument, there are strong reactions from one part or another. So that monument speaks. I had an experience which came now to my mind in a small museum room not far from the synagogue of Rome 3 years ago. The Jewish community of Rome opened a new room about the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. And I just entered to visit it. These old photographs from Second World War, and these Jews who were deported to Germany. And I thought, okay, nothing new. We know all this history. And I had somehow a light distance in front of these images. And one old lady was at the entrance and told me, do you want some explanations? And I said, no, thank you. I look that alone, on my own. And then I listened what she was saying to others, to a new group who arrived from people arriving just after me. And at a certain point, she said, you see in this photograph, this young lady between two German soldiers, well, this is my mother. And I am this small baby in the hands of this, in the arms of this young lady. At that very moment, my feeling changed completely. And from this distance in front of, okay, we know the history of Holocaust, it's dramatic, but we listened thousands of times. At that very moment, I was so touched that I could cry, being in front of a person who was directly in touch with the monument. He was like the living part of the monument. So I don't know if you could say something, if it was studied, so the impact of the living interpretation of these monuments. So because it's completely different if you are if you leave alone a monument, or if you have living persons in front of it, giving a living interpretation.
I'm not aware of studies of this kind. Probably they would be studies undertaken by sociologists or anthropologists, and I'm a political scientist. But it's certainly, I think, very true what you have said, and I'm sure every one of us has had some experience of this kind. I could recount stories myself. So earlier on in the presentation, I mentioned the Grand Master's Palace. Well, I worked in the presidential palace for 2 years in a different phase of my career. But what was and still is the biggest bond with that building is not my working there, even though it was extremely interesting and challenging, but the fact that it was associated with my grandfather. My grandfather, as a young boy, lived in Valletta. His father was the government printer. His father was besieged in the palace during the riots of June of 1919, which I mentioned. He was there because the government printing press was in the palace, and the governor wanted him to issue the proclamation, to print the proclamation declaring a state of emergency. And my grandfather had once accompanied me to an examination in Valletta. We were, as usual, several hours early because he was always very, very early. And he took me into the palace and showed me where his father had been and how he, my grandfather, took food to his father in a small side door of the palace because there was no food in the palace. So of course that creates an extraordinary bond. You have somebody who is an eyewitness to an event, especially a traumatic event, then those people are the best people to testify to the significance of the event. And again, this makes me think about your own role as guides. Because you come to your role as guides with a spiritual formation and are looking at the spiritual experience which produced a great work of art and the spiritual meaning that the artist meant to convey, you are better able to help people visiting a church, a monument, to help them appreciate the real significance of that work of art rather than just a dead work of art, one of millions of beautiful works of art. In a sense, Pietre Vive's members are a little bit like the spiritual companion or spiritual director at that moment. You are there as witnesses to the action of God's grace on the individual, visiting a church, at the moment of encounter with a work of art and the artist.
That's very nice. Thank you very much.
So we have still some time, so there is time for another question at least.
Okay, so I also was thinking a little about the role of these testimonies, no, in the monuments, memorials, in the importance for the community, no, and it is the cases you showed us really really make a point to understand how a memory is something that is born from from a community, from the people, and if if the memory lasts, then it also becomes a foundation memory of a piece of society, of a state, or a religion. So I was thinking, well, one difficulty in we experience today, at least I experience in showing people the history of the church, when visiting or speaking about the history of the church, is this importance the early Christians or medieval Christians and also modern Christians, the importance they used to give to relics. And so these bones with that we find today in Baroque churches with all these containers, these boxes, golden boxes, which sounds very strange for the modern audience and also for modern Christian audience. But it is useful to go back and think that at the beginning, the many important ancient churches were built especially over the tomb, over the place of martyrdom of a person. So they started actually as a memorial growing from the people, from the community, the companions of that person, of that saint. And so maybe it started as a few candles or flowers brought for many years in the same place. Then it became an habit to build a shrine. Then it became, if you study the history of most of medieval churches, it was made this way. Also, when the church was already a powerful institution, if they wanted to create an important church, the first thing was to export a relic and to build a church around it, in a sense. So it at some point becomes a political, also a political commitment. But it is to understand, it is important to think that everything was started with people gathering around the memory of a person that played a role in their lives, and that suffered an injustice, a murder for his faith. So it is that makes these great churches and these golden relics more alive, once you understand. In the same, as you said, when you connect with the person who was alive, you understand better. So that was my reasoning. And you have an instance also in, I was thinking St. Peter Church in Rome, like as the archaeologists found underneath the Roman cemetery with a stone, which was probably the first memorial. So that means that in the first century, people for many decades after the martyrdom of Peter were going there, remembering where this man was buried, probably brought flowers. And the earliest stone memorial was just a stone, and then in the 2nd century a little shrine. That is interesting to understand the history of a community.
Yes, we try, don't we, in so many ways, to hang on, not simply to the memory of somebody who is well loved, but also to their physical presence in some way. And what better way to do that than with a fragment of bone or a lock of hair? Nowadays, maybe we go for other things. We have so many photographs that can be used to keep the memory of somebody who was well loved alive. If a child has died and you visit the cemetery, you will see the teddy bear on the gravesite, as not just a photograph. So we hold on to the memories of those who are dear to us in very many ways. There was a time in church history when it was the bone of those who were considered to be truly holy, truly models of the faith, bone fragments. It seems macabre to us, and it's not easy to convey to visitors. But at the same time, for me, when I meet with reactions like this, I try to use the occasion to help the viewer to understand something about this sentiment of the society which behaved in this way. So in a sense as well, these customs which seem to us to be strange, maybe even barbaric, can also help us to understand the true meaning of tolerance, which means to accept people on their own terms and to value their sentiments and the way they expressed those sentiments as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now we are, unfortunately, we have finished our time, since at 5 we will have the sharing groups. Right, Julia, this is the master of the program. Yeah, so we will share 5:30, yes, but we will have some break.
Exactly, yes.
And also, I don't know if the Zoom meeting will finish sharp, but okay.
No.
That's fine.
We will get cut off.
Okay, so we have the closing prayer, and so yes. Thank you very much for that, and and then we will continue after.
So thank you all for participating. Thank you for your questions and remarks. As I said, I will send these slides to Julia and Valentina, and then you can see them at your leisure. The closing prayer is also taken from Gitanjali by Tagore, and it is the prayer I pray every day. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but in a sense, it's become dearer to me than the Psalms, because it is so close to what I have tried to dedicate my life to, my adult life to. It is a prayer for hope, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake.
Thank you very much.
All right, so
Grazie.
say goodbye. I wish you all the best for the rest of the program. God bless
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Do this. Yeah.